Hi everybody, my name is Karen Fabian and I'm the founder of Bare Bones Yoga, and today I'm going to do a quick video about hip anatomy. Now this is a precursor to my free workshop I'm going to be hosting a week from today. I'm recording this on December 5th and my workshop is a week from today on Saturday, and December 12th. At 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And I'm going to tell you right out of the gate here to sign up for that workshop if you are watching this before December 12th. All you need to do is visit my website, barebonesyoga.com, click on the events page, and you'll see the link to register. So I'm going to give you a precursor workshop, or a little snippet of some of the things we're going to talk about in that workshop. So let's take a look at the hip joint itself. The hip joint is a ball and socket joint, and that means that the two parts that connect, or that joint articulation, is comprised of the head of the femur, which is the longest bone in the body, and the acetabulum of the pelvis. Now, anytime two bones connect, that is the definition of a joint. There are many different kinds of joints. This is a ball and socket joint, and if you take a moment to consider another part of your body that has a ball and socket joint, you probably realize it is the shoulder. So ball and socket joint in hip and shoulder, and both of those joints, because of the kind of joint they're comprised of, have a good amount of movement. Now that's notwithstanding issues that people might have around flexibility or lack of flexibility, or even something going on with the infrastructure of the joint, the bony connection. Just in general, just looking at a ball in a socket, that structure affords us a good amount of movement. So if you just kind of move your arm and move your leg, you can see that you've got that kind of circular motion that is available to you that doesn't work the same in other joints that you have. And so when we take a look at the hip joint, that structure of the hip gives us several different movements that we can do. So if we take the hip forward, which essentially is moving the leg forward, that's known as hip flexion. If we take the hip back, which essentially is taking the thigh bone back, that's hip extension. And that occurs in the sagittal plane. If we take the hip out to the side, that's abduction, abduction. If we move it towards the midline, that's adduction. Those are movements in the frontal plane. If we take the hip and we turn it open, that's external rotation. And if we turn it in, that's internal rotation. Those are movements in the transverse plane. So those are all the movements that the hip allows you to do. Now I want to take a moment here to have a special mention for the pelvis, because the hip joint is the thigh bone, head of the femur, into the acetabulum of the pelvis. And so the pelvis is the two pelvic bones. Now the movements that I just described are movements of the hip. Those are different from the movements that the pelvis can make. So you can move your pelvis to the front, anteriorly, to the back, posteriorly, laterally. You can move it side to side. And so that's just something to keep in mind as well. Now, when we take a look, I'm just going to give you a really brief overview of the muscles that are there. If you join my workshop on the 12th that I mentioned at the beginning of this video at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, you'll see images of the muscles because I'll be going through a slide presentation. So if we look at the front of the hip, the anterior aspect, we've got the movement that I just referred to before of hip flexion. And so the major muscles of hip flexion are muscles like the psoas, the rectus femoris that runs from the ASIS to the knee, part of the quadriceps complex, and the sartorius, which also runs from the ASIS, the anterior superior iliac spine, to the knee as well, the medial aspect of the knee. And then if we look at the posterior hip, that is where the muscles of hip extension reside. So generally speaking, posterior chain muscles are extension related, and anterior chain muscles are flexion related, generally. So if we go to the back of the hip and we take our hip into extension, we've got the gluteus maximus, and then we also have the hamstrings. Those two are known as collaborators or synergists in the act of extension of the hip. If we look to the lateral aspect of the hip, this is where we're going to see movements like this. So if I come into Warrior Two, my hips are in abduction. The muscles responsible for that are muscles like the gluteus medius and minimus, the tensor fasciae lata, which is lower, and then the IT band, which is a thick band of fascia that runs down to the lateral aspect of the knee. If I then look at the interior aspect of the thigh, or the inner thigh, that's where I find the adductors. They're known as the adductor complex or adductor group. Muscles like the pectineus, adductor longus, and brevis are there. And so that gives you a general idea of what are the muscles involved. So now when you look at different movements, for instance, if I come into Warrior Two, I've got hips in abduction, I've got this in external rotation, and I have this in internal rotation. So you can start to think about some of the muscles that I just described and which ones might be concentrically contracting. If I come into something like eagle pose, my hips are in adduction, same with chair pose, so that's a really good strengthener for the inner thigh. If I come into airplane or dancer's pose, this hip is an extension, so muscles involved from a concentric contraction perspective would be gluteus maximus and hamstrings. So that gives you, and then just to kind of round it out, if I do something where there's a slight internal rotation of my hip, so a good example of that would be if I come into pyramid pose, or even downward facing dog pose, there's a slight internal rotation of the thighs. And interestingly enough, the anterior aspect of the gluteus medius and minimus contributes to that action there of internal rotation. So that gives you a quick overview of the structure of the hip, the muscles, some of the muscles of the hip, and how some of that applies to practice. I really want to encourage you, if you're watching this and you're thinking, I really need to know more about this, come to my workshop, because I promise you, investing your time in learning this information, not just from an academic perspective, but the application to the poses is so, so important. And then the final step is, once you know that, to translate it into the cues and sequences you share with your students. However, it's really hard to start there. In other words, it's really hard to just learn cues and not have the underlying knowledge that goes with it, because then what I often hear from teachers is, I don't have confidence when I teach. Well, how can you? If you don't really know this stuff, it's really hard to just say a bunch of cues that you were told in training without the connection between what you're saying and what you know. And so when you really start out by learning this information, guess what it does? It frees you up to cue it in your own authentic way, and then you're sharing from what you know, but in your own voice with your own words. And that becomes a much more enjoyable experience, a more authentic experience. Your students will pick up on that. And for you as a teacher, that is where your well of confidence comes from. That's where your confidence will really shine, and your joy of teaching will really spring from that. So, just a final word, if you're watching this before December 12th, 2020 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, you can sign up. There will be time for you to sign up for my free workshop. Go to the website, barebonesyoga.com, and go to the events page, and you'll see the link for the workshop. I hope to see you there. Otherwise, feel free to comment, leave a question, click the like button so this information gets out to even more teachers. YouTube will circulate it more, and more teachers will learn what you learned by watching this video. So if you enjoyed it, don't be shy, give it a thumbs up. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Namaste.